My name is Gardner Campbell. I'm one of the conveners of the Framework Annotation event that's going on right now. Thinking and annotating and talking together about Doug Engelbart's 1962 research report, Augmenting Human Intellect, a Conceptual Framework. And one of the features of the event is to have some featured annotators, folks who have some unique insights from their own vocations, from their own history with computers, from just where they are and the people they interact with. And our first featured annotator for these interview series is John Udell, who is integrator at Hypothesis. And I understand integrator means let's make this work together with as many interesting things as possible to empower the user as fully as possible. Did I get that more or less together?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I would say that Hypothesis, the tool and the service, is a general purpose thing. It's just a generally useful way to make selections in documents and have conversations and tag and collate scraps of information that you find in documents. And that works in any domain, but in particular domains, people have particular ways that they want to combine that capability with what they do. And that turns out to be very different in a variety of domains. And so I've worked with people in an area called biocuration, who are neuroscientists who are trying to catalog and really instrument the scientific literature to make it available to machine reasoning. And I've worked with journalists who are coding statements in news articles in order to develop indicators of credibility that would help with the fake news problem, and a variety of special domain-specific kinds of applications of the general purpose tool. The core of it is this fractal expansion of the web's address space, which we see kind of a glimpse of actually in the document that we're looking at, right? Because the purple numbers are hooks in the document that identify sections that you can refer to specifically, and annotation expands on that idea by giving those pointers into the document both a beginning and an end, right? So a given word or phrase in a document can have its own address, and that can be referred to, and conversation that attaches to that selection can be discovered and interacted with. And so it's it's, in that sense, it really is a very fundamental expansion of the web's capability to have this more granular way of addressing pieces of content.
Had it occurred to you to think of that in terms of annotation before you went to work at Hypothesis?
Not so much. Yeah, I mean, I thought about a lot just the basic capability of being able to address a granular piece of a web resource. I had thought about it in the context of web audio, for example, and had done some work, constructing URLs that referred to specific clips within a longer piece of audio or video. And of course, annotation means different things to different people, right? So in the neuroinformatics world, annotation is not having a conversation about a line in a poem. Annotation is identifying an antibody in a context of the methods section of a scientific paper. And actually, the vast majority of what are called annotations in bioinformatics are machine generated entity recognition. So yeah, it's a fluid term.
This happened to Engelbart as he was writing this document to begin to understand something about the fractal nature that you were talking about a minute ago, that you can think about almost any step in those layers of metadata as either figure or ground. You can think of it as a starting place, or you can think of it as one in an N series of layers built upon another starting place. He actually imagines that at one point, which is not in a section that we're looking at, but he talks about specification, organization, and content. And he doesn't develop it all the way, but it becomes clear pretty quickly from what he does say that anywhere you go in there, you will also find specification, organization, and content. You plugged into some of that in your own notes. Was that something that you were aware of as you were going along, that this was user experience, user interface, programming.
I think that's part of maybe the cognitive impedance mismatch that we all struggle with, right? Is that these hierarchical layers of abstraction that people take for granted in certain technical fields, and work with all the time, so take for granted, are very much not natural or obvious to most people.
Is this related to your remark about I want to make sure I get it right, the tangled loop as a particularly heavy lift for people who are not living in that world?
Yes, absolutely.
So say some more about that. You hyperlinked to it. The hyperlink itself is a kind of an annotation, but it'd be interesting to know. This caught your eye as you were going along. The section you're annotating makes no difference to the computer whether the symbols involved in the restructuring represent part of the computer programming or part of the information upon which the program is operating. The ability to have the computer modify its own process structure, meaning its program, has been a very important factor in the development of its power. And you say at this point, the tangled loop is one of the ways our physical intuition fails us in the digital domain. So amplify that a little for us.
So what I would say he's describing there is the phenomenon of self-modifying code, right? So code it describes behavior, right? It's a recipe that describes behavior, but it's also data, right? And so what the code recipe can do is modify other data. That's what it usually does. But it can also modify its own data, right? Which leads to things like the idea of genetic programming and in all sorts of directions. But it just is, there's a level of fluidity there that you don't encounter in the real world, and that you don't have physical intuitions for. And actually, part of what I was asking myself, I think, in that comment is, if we say that this is something that quote unquote everyone needs to learn, and I think this is part of what's behind this, let's get everyone to code meme, right? I wonder about that, right? Like, I wonder if that's even an appropriate core literacy for everyone. I'm not sure that it is.
What informs your uncertainty about that? Why would that not necessarily be something that we would want everybody to have?
Because it's really hard. It's like it seemed hard for me to think about those things, and I've spent a lot of my life in a world where I do think about those things. But also the only reason that I do is that there are practical applications that are important, and I'm not sure I see immediate practical applications for that particular mental skill in other domains. But that's just me. What do you see as possible?
Well, it's interesting. I was reading just today about the new advanced placement tests that ETS has been putting together. And there's this emphasis on the two codes that you must understand to have agency in a democracy in the contemporary world. One of them is the US Constitution, which is, interestingly, both a recipe and some provision for self-modification, ideas to think with about ideas you're thinking about. And the other is computer coding. And the point of view that they expressed was that you're not likely to be able to understand the way in which people with understanding are creating your world if you don't have some working knowledge of those creative methods and what sorts of results they might yield. One is never sure. Do I have to become a virtuoso violinist to become somebody who listens to violin music? No, probably not. Should I be able to play the violin to get a deeper appreciation of the violin music I'm listening to? I would say almost certainly. And then the question is, well, I want to listen to an orchestral recording. Do I have to learn every instrument? They're diminishing returns.
Mm-hmm.
The ETS point of view is that now the world is being modified and constructed so deeply and quickly through computer coding that one risks losing key parts of one's agency in a democracy if you can't at least play a tune on the recorder, so to speak, if you can't at least have the experience, which is actually available without a huge investment, but it's not easy. It's like trying to think about math, or in some respects, trying even to think rigorously about metaphor. You start to feel like you're sliding down a glass wall. What do I hold on to here? How do I start? And you have to know some things. So I don't know. I think about this all the time. It's particularly applicable to Engelbart's vision because he anticipated that we would all be able to and want to learn a lot more about the methodologies in which we are trained in a technological world that he knew was coming simply because of the scale of technological progress.
You know, I think about a lot is, was he insufficiently aware of how difficult it would be for an average person to attain that level of proficiency? You know, to memorize that many things. You know, and I struggle with this on a daily basis, to tell you the truth, because you know, the tools that I use in my work are vastly more capable than I will ever be able to master. You know, and I am only able to use a tiny fraction of the capability, and I'm constantly aware of the tension between the investment that I could make to master more of that capability, you know, versus the cost of making that investment, right? And so more and more, I'm sort of led to a place of, you know, we need to make our tools and infrastructure afford these capabilities to us in a way that is progressively and naturally discoverable, and that doesn't place huge cognitive burden on us, right? Because in the end, I mean, there's the, you know, what is it, the, you know, the 5 to 7 things you can keep, you know, in working memory, right? I mean, we have to work with that, right? That's how we're wired, right? You know, I'm not going to learn thousands of commands, right? I need a way for the ones that I actually have to have at my fingertips to know that they need to surface in a context where I don't have to go looking for them or remembering them. And I'm really frustrated with how seemingly little progress we've made on that front. Although you see all sorts of glimpses of it. You know, I mean, at one point, he talks a lot about just the mechanics of text editing and the efficiencies around that. You know, and he can see past this idea of memorizing a bunch of commands to the, hey, actually, at one point, I think he anticipates autocompletion, right? Like, like it's not just that you would remember the abbreviation, right? But, you know, you would start to type the thing, and then the system could see its way to what the possibilities were, right? So, yeah, I was really fascinated to see that intuition.
He knew that famous paper, the George Miller 7 plus or minus 2 paper, both directly and also because he knew the work of Jerome Bruner pretty well, as several places in oral histories make clear, and also in the research I've been doing. He actually compiled a bibliography, it looks like a prospectus for a dissertation, frankly, as part of his attempt to structure his own research. And he's interesting in that he also understands the workaround for the 7 plus or minus 2, which Bruner discusses. One of the workarounds is that you find a certain level of abstraction or conceptual complexity that can then stand as a kind of a unity or has a certain integrity to it, and that becomes one of the 7 plus or minus 2. So instead of isolated discrete things, you have you know, a sentence that makes sense. Well, if it's a sentence that makes sense, probably now instead of 14 words, you've got one thing that you'll have in your 7 plus or minus 2. If you get the right rhythm going between, you know, the nudges, the complex concepts, and just where do I put my finger to type an H, you know, you can do more. That at least is the promise of education, right? So this brings me to another thing I want to ask you about that comes from your annotations. You talk about the way in which computer systems ought to be adaptive to what you term necessary and worthy, personal idiosyncrasies. How would that happen exactly, or what's keeping that from happening more?
I think what's keeping all kinds of what I might call mass customization from happening is that still most products and services are built for large populations, right? So you have to do the thing that satisfies the most number of people. And that's not just true in tech. It's for example, it's true in drug development, right? And so the promise of personalized medicine is very much like the promise of personalized IT infrastructure, right? That in the end, we are all, if not completely unique, we are members of relatively small groups that work in particular and idiosyncratic ways. And it has historically been way too expensive to develop a drug that targets a population of a few dozen, right? And likewise, to develop a software product that targets a population of a few dozen. And in both cases, I don't know how we crack that nut, but I assume that it's going to come from the ability to, number one, I hate the term big data, right? But what big data is, among other things, is a bunch of descriptions of smaller things, right? Aggregated, and if you can get to those smaller descriptions and work with them, you've got at least information about what you'd want to try to accomplish. But then there's just the really hard problem of how do I cost effectively develop software that is targeting a small population, a given work group, right, that has a particular style, and that's just plain a hard problem.
But at some point, it might be possible, if I'm reading what you've written about the document correctly, for certain kinds of self-modifying programs to be able to analyze the way we choose to work, or to be able to sense what particular needs we might have, and to be able to interact with us in a way that becomes more familiar, feeling more like an extension of the kinds of things that we already like and tend to do.
Yeah, the problem right now, or a problem right now, I guess, is that to the extent that our systems do learn and adapt through interaction with us, it's happening in an adversarial way, right? It's happening as a result of surveillance capitalism, and these tools, these systems that we depend on, aren't working for us. And not only are they not working for us, they're actually working against us, right? So, and I do think I do think he didn't see that coming, and would be really sad to see the state that we're in right now. And so how do we align our tools and systems with our own agendas is that's not a technical question, right? But it's a key question.
And often quite explicitly in the document itself, philosophical questions, social questions, ethical questions. And people will sometimes lose sight of that as they read the document, in part because it's such an odd and hybrid document, at times reading in a very technical way, in a way that you go, oh, that's an engineer writing. And at other times, it's like a science fiction story, or it's like a set of reasoning and moral philosophy, or it's, especially at the beginning, a kind of manifesto. It's an interesting document in that the discourse style can sometimes change very radically, even within a particular paragraph.
To be honest, I never read the whole thing, and it was it's an exercise to read it. There are a lot of words there, a lot of nouns in particular. Many uses of the word structuring and structure. It's been. I'm glad you brought me to it again. It's been interesting.
You are someone who is able to work in the world of coding and development, and able to write about it in ways that back from the early days in Byte, you're trying to address a very broad community by thinking about ways to describe and help people to understand just what's happening across some really disparate use cases. How do you come to this as a writer, and how do you think about, or do you think about ways in which writing is itself an idiosyncratic kind of coding that nevertheless has some best practices?
Well, I think about writing a lot that way, and I definitely wished that Doug Engelbart had an editor.
You could say he had some virtual editors along the way because his bosses would keep signing off on things as he would write successive drafts for project proposals, grant proposals, and so forth. But the person who worked most closely with him as a writer leading up to the publication of the 1962 report was a very talented woman who went on to a career in librarianship, but was working as a project manager for the Air Force Office of Scientific Research. And her name was Rowena Swanson. And we don't have a lot of the back and forth, but we have some of it between the two of them, where she's actually making specific suggestions about ways to redo parts of the document, or where she thought it might be succeeding, places where maybe it was succeeding less well. The thing that keeps coming across, though, even more than the mechanics of, am I making myself clear? Is this being written in a catchy way? She keeps recognizing the very difficult and recursive and in some ways unprecedented thing he was trying to do with this. Mm-hmm. In some ways, she was an ideal editor, at least it seems to me, because rather than focusing on sentence or even paragraph level construction, she kept trying to think with him about whether this paradigm shift was coming across as that. Mm-hmm. And it's really fascinating to see the two of them interact that way. And while the document was being prepared for the eventual report to the AFOSR, she was working with him at the same time to boil it down to around a 50-page excerpt that was to be published in a book. And he credits her there, says that essentially this would not have come out if she had not spent all that time editing it. And yeah, it's really fascinating to see that process. It was such a strange project, almost unimaginable. Mm-hmm. And I see him constantly trying to articulate the many things that are looping around in his head to help to paint that picture for people who had never thought of anything like that before, or were not likely to think about the system in that way.
Well, and more to the point, maybe we're not anytime soon going to be able to experience anything that would help them relate to what was being said. So, I mean, we have the benefit, at least, that we now use systems, that give us some semblance of the capabilities that he was envisioning and was himself experiencing. But yeah, I mean, I don't know, how do you solve that problem, right? I mean, how is it anything but science fiction when what you're describing is not yet part of anyone's experience, right? Because you kind of have to have those experiences for yourself to really relate to what's being said.
Let me ask you one more meta question. How do you decide what to take notes on? There you are with the document. You know that part of the assignment here is for John Udell to annotate part of this document. As you're doing that, as you reflect on what catches your eye and how you choose to respond to it, anything come into conscious awareness? Do you have any thoughts or ways of describing your process as an annotator, which is really your process as a reader?
I hadn't actually thought about that. I suppose it's just a case of noticing places where I think that my own experience can be brought to bear on some aspect of this and can add some perspective to it, right? I've never been someone who highlights things, although it's interesting. I mean, we look at how people use hypothesis, and there are some people who use it exclusively for highlighting, and they never make any notes, right? And some people use it for conversational purposes. Some people use it for the sort of note-taking that is capturing and organizing scraps of information for later use. But yeah, in this case, I think it was simply trying to do what you asked, which was, find the things in there that you think you in particular could usefully react to. And that's what I tried to do. I am trying to do.
Do you notice that as you do that, it changes your experience?
Oh, sure. I mean, it has to, right? And one of the well, I haven't done it. I haven't done it here, but one of the things that I have done that isn't like highlighting, but kind of is there are if I'm reading a book and there's something that I want to remember, um, I used to actually write out by hand. Back when I was in college, I would like write out by hand the quote from the book, because that felt like it was a way of putting me into the author's experience, and it really would imprint those things, in a way that's just simply highlighting it wouldn't. And I do that now with dictation, actually, which has an interesting effect. But that's a different thing to, you know, annotating with a purpose to add, or converse, right? So I think we're in that latter mode here.
But when you do that, there is a little bit of that leakage back into the old days when you would copy it out by hand. Simply annotating something, recording your response, also changes the you who is responding because of the very act of annotation. It brings something, it's an event for you, not simply standing outside of a timeline, right? It's something that has
no, I mean, looking back on this, I'll be really glad to have a record of the places in that document that caught my attention, right? That's a very useful thing.
Part of what I seek to learn from all of the stuff I'm doing, but certainly this annotation event, is what will trigger acts of attention, and how do cognitive kinds of commitments to acts of attention translate from experts to novices? What are the commonalities there that we could maybe pay attention to and be a little more mindful of? And I think in some ways that folds into the document itself, the whole idea that once you have made an intervention at an appropriately basic level, there can be, if you would like, lots of bootstrapping effects, lots of consequences that actually accelerate the entire system.
Well, one of the things we do see with classrooms who are using the annotation tool for collaborative close reading is that if one student highlights a thing and says, I am confused by this, I don't understand what's going on, that opens the door to others admitting that they felt the same way, and it's a real conversational icebreaker.
I'm delighted to have your thoughts in the mix, and if it becomes historically useful and interesting to you to go back and see where was I at that point and what was I thinking, then that's a great bonus too. It's I hope going to spark more and more attention and conversation around this document, which, as you point out, is not necessarily the easiest document in the world to read, but I think it's one of the richest, and it turns out that it had a great deal to do with how we ended up in the world we're in now. So what do you believe is possible in this species that would tend to the good? Or are we fated forever to tear down things at a slightly faster rate than we build them up? That was the bet, right?
Well, I feel like we're going to find out sooner rather than later.
We'll check in again, won't we?
We will indeed. Thank you, Gardner.
All right. Thank you, John.